to you all. Welcome to our Earth Day celebration. It was 45 years ago today, April 22nd of 1970, that the very first Earth Day was celebrated. The very first effort towards that was on the vernal equinox, the first day of spring in 1970, when universities did a teach-in on environmental issues. And I forgot to bring it, but I have the button from the very first Earth Day on the University of New York's campus at Syracuse. A guy by the name of Dr. Bill Webb was threatened with his job, dare he do a teach-in in 1970. And then it was Senator Gaylord Nelson that put together the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. And it wasn't until 1972 when the big blue marble photograph came about, when the astronauts finally looked back from space and saw the planet. We want to thank the Slavic Foundation for sponsoring our conservation conversation. Thank you very much for doing that. Also wanted to mention that Robert Rauschenberg did the first Earth Day poster. And he also did the first poster for the very first Earth Summit sponsored by the United Nations. Now, I quite frankly don't know how to introduce Charles LeBuff to you because it's going to be the next hour of introducing him to you by having a conversation with him. Charles, I think, was the second person on Sanibel I ever met. Edie Stokes was first. When I walked into the Refuge offices in the very beginning of November of 1983. Charles has some very dear friends with him here today that have spent a lot of his lifetime with him. And I thought I'd give you a chance to first say we're really grateful that you're here, Charles, and to let you introduce your friends, and then I'm going to tell on you. Okay. So,
thank you, Christy. When Christy asked me to do this conversation, it was sort of a welcome back to the SCCF and a chance to share some information and just have a general conservation conversation. But before I start, and we'll be going in, I hope, many different directions this afternoon, I'd like to introduce, first of all, my wife, Jean. My wife of 57 years. There you go. We met in September of 1953 in high school. We were married 4 years later. But about 10 months before I met Jean, I met two other people. My first friends in Florida. One is Billy Curtis, sitting here, and her husband Ralph Curtis, way in the back. And I'm proud that they're my friends and intimate friends for over 60 years now. And then when I came to Sanibel in '58, things began to roll along for me in my career. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but I started Coretta Research. And one of the early workers of Coretta Research is seated back here, Jim Anholt. Jim, will you stand up?
One of the originals.
He's one of the originals, and he's wearing the original Coretta Research shirt. We were a quasi-official group. We were permitted by the state of Florida, but we ran a very tight ship, so everyone was in uniform when we were out in the field. So with that, I think I covered all bases. I see a few familiar faces, and it's sure nice to see you out today, Bird, and Eric, and other folks that I recognize. Jeff, glad you're here. And I don't know where this is going, but if you hear something that we don't cover in full discourse, I still work at Macintosh Bookshop on Sanibel every Sunday. Come in and we'll continue the conversation. So, Christy.
Yeah, well, it's the best way I have of catching up with you is showing up at the bookshop, so it is a good thing. You know, when I asked Charles to to put together a little bit of his life history, we ended up with this. And I thought, wow, I made it as a poster, and all of a sudden I realized that you really need to see what this man's career is all about. So that's why you have it in your hand. One of the things that's, I don't know, that's ever come out about Charles and all of the work that he's done is how much of that work has been community service, not for DUIs, but community service in that he's, took you a second, didn't it? In that it wasn't his job as a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employee. The work that he did was stuff that he did at night. When I walked into those offices the next summer in 1984, Charles would be at his desk all day long, or out in the field, or out in the boat, and then he'd be up till 2 in the morning doing sea turtles, because it's what he loved to do. It wasn't necessarily what his job was. I asked him when I was at McIntosh Bookstore, I said, is there anything you'd change? Is there anything you really would do differently? And he kind of sat back a little bit and he said, you know, I ran for city council. And because he's a federal employee, he can't mix being a federal employee with being a volunteer with the city of Sanibel. So all his vacation time went to serving as a city councilman. And he didn't get a chance to take as many trips with his family as he may like. So he volunteered with Coretta, he volunteered here at SCCF, he volunteered with the city of Sanibel, he volunteered as a board member of the Audubon Society. I think you were chair, weren't you?
President. Yeah.
President of Audubon Society. And so it gives you an idea of how much one person can accomplish outside their own career, because it's just been remarkable. And I really want to thank you for all of that.
Thank you, Christy. Yeah.
So on the back of your piece of paper, it's something you probably wouldn't have expected, is a photograph of dynamite going off. And it wasn't Charles blowing up the island, but I thought I'd start talking about the interior wetlands, because it was a very unique area on the island. It was a place where alligators could roam, and some of your frogs and your turtles lived. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the evolution of the Bailey Tract, because it's a very odd configuration. In the early 50s aerials, it's a nice rectangle of land, and then all of a sudden these ponds show up. And just wonder if you could tell us what your recollections of that interior wetland was like.
Okay. When the Fish and Wildlife Service established Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge in '45, nothing really happened on the island for about another 4 years. And in 1949, Tommy Wood was appointed the first refuge manager. He's the person that brought me to Sanibel. And they didn't own any land. They had a negotiated lease with the Coast Guard for Point Bell, which is now Lighthouse Point, and approximately 2,000 acres of mangrove habitat on the northern side of Sanibel, where the present refuge, part of the land in the present refuge. So they wanted to do some wildlife management to try to enhance habitat. And you must remember that back in the 50s, the Fish and Wildlife Service was not an agency of public education. It was geared more toward wildlife management, and specifically migratory waterfowl. That was what the Fish and Wildlife Service was all about. So they wanted to develop habitat to attract and to support migratory birds, chiefly migratory waterfowl in the winter. So they negotiated a purchase with Frank Bailey, Francis Bailey's father, to buy 100 acres in the center of the Sanibel Slough, west of Tarpon Bay Road, which is now popularly called the Bailey Tract. And the refuge manager at the time, who supervised Tommy Wood, his name was Gerald Baker, He was the second manager of the Everglades National Wildlife Refuge. Ian Beard was the first manager, and to reflect back in time, go back into the 30s and 40s, that Everglades National Wildlife Refuge was the forerunner of today's Everglades National Park. So the Fish and Wildlife Service controlled wildlife protection, wildlife management in South Florida. So Baker was gung-ho on developing habitat for waterfowl. So he sent over an equipment operator and a small bulldozer, and they went into the Bailey Tract and began to just push up Spartina grass into low-level dikes into compartments. And in those compartments, they planted waterfowl food plants, like rice, for example. And then they realized they had no water source, so they needed to provide water to try to flood some of these compartments, but they had no funds to pay for such irrigation supplies. So Ding Darling offered to drive in a 500-foot artesian well that was supposedly, theoretically, would provide a volume of water to begin flooding these compartments. So Ding put that in. It's right just west of where the parking lot is in the Bailey Tract now. And then in '56, the Fish and Wildlife Service put in a 8-inch well a little further north. And by 1957, when I came over to decide if I was going to take the position, they were drilling another 8-inch well further north, closer to Island Inn Road. But all of these failed. It could not provide enough water. To take you back just to 1959 in the Bailey Tract, I could walk from where the parking lot is south on the bottom of the Sanibel Slough. It was basically unvegetated. There were no cattails, open muck habitat. And you wouldn't sink down in the mud, but you could look down and there would be fissures in the earth that went down 18 inches deep, completely bone dry. So Sanibel had no permanent water in those early years. There were about 20 alligator holes in the Sanibel Slough and in some of the temporary ponds, but most of that habitat dried up. So in about 1950, Gerald Baker decided to send over a crew from Loxahatchee Refuge, and they selected a spot near the mangrove head in the Bailey Tract. And the photograph that you have in your handout is the result of 225 sticks of dynamite erupting in the Bailey Tract, trying to provide a lower basin. The blasted earth would leave. When the rains came, the water would seep in. Alligators would find the blasted holes, continue to keep them open as alligator holes and maintain permanent fresh water. And it worked. And then over time, the Bailey Tract began to change again. We had a contract with Lee County to allow Lee County to dig up sand and fill from the Bailey Tract in the northwest corner when Captiva Road was washing away completely. So the county went in and dug more open water habitat. And that's why that large pond is in the northwest corner. And then when it came time to build a new visitor center complex on Sandcap Road, we again went in and excavated fill, providing more open habitat. So that's basically the transformation of the Bailey Tract. Did that answer your question?
Well, there's a straight line on the south end of the Bailey Tract that's adjacent to the Dayton Preserve.
Well, that line's not exactly straight.
Well, somebody put some poles out in the
That's
middle
right.
of the swale. You mind telling them?
When I came to Sanibel, we had a seaplane. The refuge manager was the pilot. And he kept the seaplane at his home on the very end of Woodring Point on Tarpon Bay. That's where he had bought a private residence. He and his wife, and actually his brother was one of the owners. And he would live there part of the year, and at the lighthouse in one of the quarters another part of the year. And the seaplane was kept on Tarpon Bay. And it was in salt water, of course, and salt water caused corrosion on float plane floats. So he wanted another site to stow the airplane. So when I arrived here in '58, mosquito control had excavated, had just reached to the west of Beach Road, and they were beginning their channelization of the Sanibel Slough, creating the Sanibel River. So by the time they got to Tarpon Bay Road, or were just about to cross Tarpon Bay Road, Tommy Wood called in Wayne Miller and said, I know you don't follow property lines and you just meander through the habitat, but I need a spot to set down the seaplane. So will you dig on the south boundary of the Bailey Tract, a wide canal? And Wayne Miller, the director at the time, agreed. And Tommy sent me out and I went down on Woodring Point Road. It used to run along the bay in front of the Bailey store all the way to the very tip of Woodring Point. And I went down Woodring Point Road and I found 3 straight white mangrove saplings, and I cut them down. And the next morning we put some flagging on these poles, and we set the first pole on Tarpon Bay, which would be the northern boundary of the seaplane canal. And then I was to walk out through the marsh dragging 2 poles, and Tommy Wood would get up on the dragline crane, because the dragline hadn't started digging yet, and he would sight me, and I'd have to walk a half mile through that marshland to the western boundary, set up the pole, and then come back equidistant approximately and set another pole. Well, I think Tommy might have had a couple the night before and he didn't get quite lined up. So when Colin Moore, the dragline operator, he's the same one that built, same individual that built the Wildlife Drive, he faithfully followed the alignment of those 2 poles. So the seaplane canal has a distinctive bend in it. But we kept the aircraft. We went, when I first came here, we had a Piper Tri-Pacer, and then we had a Piper Super Cub, and then a Cessna 180 was the last plane that we flew out of there. And it flew out of there from '61 until about 1971.
He was a good pilot.
Yes, sir.
That's not an easy canal to land on.
That's right. I only know of one other seaplane pilot to set down on that, and his name was Tommy Hines. He was a special agent with the Fish and Wildlife Service. He lived in Sebring, and he'd set his seaplane down there too. But it was hairy, especially when vegetation began to grow and wind shifts.
You almost always had a crosswind on.
That's right. I've taken off and landed in that many a time. I never flew the plane in a route. I flew the plane, but I was never allowed to put it down. That was a wise choice.
So Charles, it was open and muck, so were there fires back then? Was there such a thing as a prescribed burn program? What did those interior wetlands, how did that change?
I think there were controlled burns planned, but I don't think they were ever successful. But what would happen, the slough would catch fire from lightning strikes in the summertime, and the faithful Sanibel Fire Control District would always rush and put them out. So we never had the full benefit of fire for 30 or 40 years in the slough. And I recall 2 major fires. One burned from Casabel Road to Tarpon Bay Road. That was a great fire. It made a lot of changes, but they put it out at Tarpon Bay Road. Then another fire threatened. We had an observation tower at the Bailey Tract, and another fire threatened that. They put that out. That was good because at the seaplane base we had a 500-gallon above-ground tank of gasoline, so that was good. And then we had a fire that ran from Tarpon Bay Road basically all the way to Rabbit Road, and they put it up. And those are the only two fires that really amounted to anything, but they weren't controlled burns. They were wildfires. which were always common. And then in the 70s, different refuge managers started coming along after Tommy Wood retired in 1971 and trying to apply some of the methods of wildlife management they had been taught in college. They decided to start wildlife management, controlled burns, and I know there was a lot of difficulty in getting some of the early burns through the city council, but finally the program of controlled burns started, and now I think it's a fine program.
Yeah, good. Great. I'm gonna, see, I should let you sit for a minute, but I'm gonna back up a little bit to the very first part of your career. Well, there's the Pipers, the Les Piper and Everglades Wonder Garden, but your first federal job was Red Tide, from what I understand. Now, I have a voice recording of Ding Darling, who is saying, "It's not a tide and it's not red." And he actually sent money over to the University of Miami back in the 40s to start investigating red tide, because he had problems with his lungs, and there were a couple of winters when he couldn't be here because the red tide outbreaks were so bad. But I understand in the mid-1950s, you've got the date, I don't, you started working on a red tide program for the state of Florida? Or was it with the federal government? Can you tell us a little bit about that early red tide research?
I think part of it was, Ding Darling was partly responsible for what became a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service research laboratory being established in Naples in the early part of 1956. I had worked at Everglades Wonder Gardens. That's where I met Ralph Curtis and enjoyed a sort of a beginning of a career there in wildlife. But in 1956, after the Red Tide Lab had opened in Naples, I was appointed as a fishery technician at that field station, and I worked there for close to a couple of years. We did basic research on red tide, the red tide phenomena between Tampa Bay and Marathon and the Keys. My duties were, a lot of it was field work, collecting water samples. I worked on a 48-foot research vessel. There's a photograph in one of these posters. And we would go from Paso Grill to Marathon. And on our trips to Marathon, we'd run offshore grids collecting seawater, surface and bottom samples. And when we get to Marathon, Tommy Wood, the manager here at Sanibel, would fly the tri-pacer down to Marathon and pick up the water samples that we had frozen and fly them back to Naples. They'd be picked up at the dock at Naples, taken to the lab and analyzed for all sorts of organisms. It was really interesting work. A lot of it was microscopic work. I learned to identify all kinds of microorganisms that I've long forgotten. And the red tide phenomena, we all know it's still ongoing. And this was in 56, 57, and I like to say that in all those years, we really haven't learned that much more about red tide. We're doing some guessing. We've changed the scientific name of the organism that causes it. We've developed technology to perhaps forecast it, but we still don't know that much more about it. And in 57, the Fish and Wildlife Service transferred the red tide work to the state of Florida, and the troops from, they had moved to St. Pete Beach, and those biologists all went to Galveston, Texas. I chose not to make the move, and I'd worked with Tommy quite a bit in the field. We'd fly from Naples to Okeechobee, Lake Hicpochee, and inland waters to collect water samples. It wasn't just a marine study, it was fresh and marine. And so Tommy and I became fairly knowledgeable of each other, and he offered me the job here on Sanibel, and it was a slow process, but I eventually moved here and spent 32 years at Ding Darling. I retired actually 25 years ago this month. It's been a great life since. I'm getting a lot done, and I don't miss anything.
You don't miss polyester uniforms? Well, had there been, in your studies with red tide, I know there were red tide outbreaks in the 40s. Were there some that you recall happened during your time at the lighthouse and into your time with Fish and Wildlife Service? Because a lot of people think it's a new phenomenon.
No, red tides go back to biblical times. I mean, it's not uncommon. The 1947 hurricane is when the organism was first identified at Venice, north of here. And in my experience, most of the red tide outbreaks always started north of here and eventually worked south. So I have a little bit of a problem blaming the Caloosahatchee on all these red tide outbreaks. I'm not sure there's a relationship between the red tides that eventually ends up here from those that start, 75, 80 miles north. They haven't shown a relationship to satisfy me. But red tides were not common after 1947. We'd get some minor red tides, and during my career in the Naples lab, we had one red tide outbreak at Paso Grill, way north. So, let's blame Tampa Bay river system on that one. And we took the seaplane and flew up with sacks of copper sulfate tied to the floats. And I went out on the float, and Tommy just idled the engine up, and I cut the bags open, and we drifted copper sulfate, and lo and behold, it killed the red tide organism. But you can kill it, but you can't control it. So, getting back to my original statement, there's not that much more that we know about it.
Yeah.
Did I get your?
No, it's.
Outbreaks, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there's been some Lulu outbreaks. How many of you were here in 1971? Oh, remember the 71 red tide? It was a summer red tide. It lasted July, August, and September. And despite what Ding Darling may have said, the water was red. It was rusty red. And it smelled to high heavens. And there were dead fish by the trillions from the lighthouse all the way to Redfish Pass. I'd make a turtle run at night, and there'd be snook lined up dead, 30, 35-pound snook, dead sea turtles. It was just one terrible mess, the worst that I had ever experienced. And a little aside to that story, I always like to tell this one. Up until 71, I managed nuisance alligators on program. And then I lucked out and I tossed it up to other people like bird. But in 71, one of my last experiences, and one of the reasons that I quit fooling with alligators, George Weymouth, who many of you may have known, who lived here back in those days, and a friend of mine from the north was visiting us. And I got a call from Jack Rushworth at Island Inn that there was an alligator in the Gulf. Well, alligators in the Gulf are no big deal. It happens every summer. Sometimes in the winter, they go into the Gulf. But when there's a red tide, with all that attractant, smelly fish, more than usual crossed over the beach ridge into the Gulf of Mexico. So I got to Island Inn, and there were about 50 people lined up on the beach watching this alligator. So I decided I'd have a little fun, so we'd catch the alligator. So if you ever tried to catch an alligator in the Gulf of Mexico, it's virtually impossible. So I said, George, let's go out there and see what we can do. So I said, come on, Eddie, my friend. Oh, hell no, I'm not going out there in that stinking water. He stayed up on the beach. So George and I went out there, and we were 25, 30 feet apart. And the alligator was on the bottom sulking, and I happened to look down through this red rusty water, and I saw the shape of, I was about this deep in water. I saw the shape of the alligator. I said, here he is, George, doing what I had done hundreds of times. I dropped down on the alligator. It's a 6-foot alligator. I dropped down on the alligator to get it behind the head, misjudged because of the magnification, and my right hand is in the alligator's mouth. Now, if you've ever been bitten by an alligator, you know it's very painful. And it makes you want to swear off alligators. So the process started right then. So I said, George, the blankety blank's got me by the hand. Come over here. So by that time I had the alligator up and I had him between my legs and I had a grip on his rear left leg so he couldn't roll, because if an alligator bites you, you don't want it to roll. You don't want it to shake. You really don't want it to move. So George comes over and he got another grip on the alligator where I could turn my left hand loose, and I put my fingers on his eyes and I said, okay, we're either going to have a blind alligator or he'll release. And I pressed his eyes and he released. So I looked at my hand real quick, it just poured, lacerations on both sides, pouring blood. So I said, here, take it, George, and go up to the Jeep and get me a towel. So George took the alligator up and trusted that I stayed out in the water because I didn't want to see these 50 or 60, 70 people by then, all this blood. So he brings me back a towel and I wrap it up and go up to Island Inn and I clean it out real well and got it under control as far as bleeding. And we took the alligator and measured it, sexed it, and tagged it. And you all know how to sex alligators? Oh.
Go for it.
Well, we wanted to sex this alligator, so I said, Eddie, to my friend, come over here. I want you to sex this alligator. Well, how do I do that? I said, well, take your index finger, insert it into its cloaca, its vent. Not really a rectum, but rectum. And you'll feel, if it's a male, you'll feel a penis. If you don't feel a penis, it's a female. Hell no, I'm no proctologist. So I George, and it was a male. So we took the alligator and did our thing, did data collection, and everything was fine. The next morning I woke up, we were living at the lighthouse at the time, and went into the bathroom and turned around and looked into the mirror, and I had red welts, blisters, like water blisters, all over my body. Almost every square inch of my body was covered by these. So I woke Jean and told her, look what's going on here. She couldn't figure out what it was. But in those days you didn't go to the doctor because you just didn't go to the doctor. So I let things go through its course, but the next day they were all gone. But in retrospect, I think that was some kind of a reaction to the red tide toxin.
And the alligator bite.
And the alligator bite, it got into my bloodstream through the alligator bite. So soon after that, I gave up alligators. Bird, you can tell your story, and you're doing this 30 years from now.
So, but let's see, in the 1947 declaration of the Sanctuary Islands of Sanibel and Captiva, it said that there would be an Island Wildlife Conservation Commission, and part of it would determine whether or not species were out of balance. But it seems to me, and you can set me straight on this, that this is when there was first an evolution of this alligator program. That you came in the 50s, but trying to figure out this alligator relocation program and how that fit into the story of conservation of the islands, and wondered if you had any enlightening history on that.
Well, the 1939 Special Act set up the committee, the Lee County Refuge Commission, made up of residents of Sanibel and Captiva. The alligator program was my own creation.
Ah, another thing that's your fault.
Yeah, true. Because before, an alligator would take a dog. An alligator killed Tommy Woods' dog near the lighthouse in the Kinsey boat basin. And rather than kill it, he had the Piper brothers from Bonita Springs come and take the alligator away. So when I arrived on Sanibel, I had already done alligator work in Collier County. I was under permit from the state of Florida as an individual researcher. So here I come to Sanibel, and man, I gotta have something to do. I miss my alligators, and I'm doing surveys on frogs and snakes and lizards and turtles and my everyday work, but I needed something else to do. So I launched my alligator program here without a state permit, because back in those days, all of Sanibel was considered, because of the closure boundary established in 1947, 2 years after the refuge was established. We considered all of Sanibel within that closure order to be refuge. And we, the Fish and Wildlife Service, controlled all wildlife species within that boundary. That's just the way the system worked. We were the law enforcement people. The state Game Commission never came to Sanibel because Tommy and I were both deputized wildlife officers through the state. The Board of Conservation, the Marine Patrol, they did come to Sanibel, but nothing to do with game and freshwater fish. It was our responsibility. So I launched this program, tagging, capturing, recapturing, and as part of this I would go to complaints. Alligators in ponds, people complained, and we would take them and relocate them to the refuge, or later became the refuge. And of course we learned early on that they were back to their point of capture in 5 days. It was non-working. It was done in theory only.
Yeah, we had a little 2x4 education every once in a while, I remember.
Yeah, we did.
Negative deterrence. Yeah.
Yep, we did. We would train alligators to back off when a person approached the water's edge, and those kinds of things. Unfortunately, it didn't work in all cases, and we had some serious situations later on. But not because of any relocation program, simply because of the way things had changed. Ralph Curtis and I had a conversation a while ago about alligators, and 60 years ago, we would swim at night in the Imperial River, knowing there were 10 and 12-foot alligators in that river without any consideration or fear. And I said to Ralph, I said, why do you think that is, Ralph? He says, hell, back in those days, we threw things at them. We threw rocks at them, we threw pieces of wood, and they were afraid of us. Now, if you throw a piece of wood or a rock at an alligator, you're harassing them, and you're subject to persecution. That's the difference. That's one of the differences.
Yeah, you were the one that taught me not to go swimming at the beach at night because of other shadows.
That was because of sharks.
Yes. I don't
Yeah,
do that.
I taught my children, both who were reared at the lighthouse, never to go swimming in the Gulf of Mexico at night. I think it's an important point.
Yeah. There were too many nights on the beach where I saw shadows.
Oh, yeah.
So in this, kind of going back to the interior wetlands and the Sanibel, you made a transition in your terminology from the Sanibel Slough to the Sanibel River. And it had to do with T. Wayne Miller, I have to assume. There was originally a Sanibel Mosquito Control, and then they united as the Lee County Mosquito Control, and T. Wayne Miller, I think, was its first director. But what was the goal of putting the drag line down through the center of the island? What was the purpose for that?
Well, the nuisance mosquito here was and is the salt marsh mosquito, and it lays its eggs in damp, moist areas. After the water recedes, like this time of year, and the slough or a body of water goes dry, in the early days, we still had voluminous populations of mosquitoes because there was no real mosquito control at the time. So these salt marsh mosquitoes would get a blood meal, a bird, a sea turtle, a human, and lay their eggs in these moist areas. And then when the rains came, June, July, and August, it would raise the elevation of water in the Sanibel Slough, and those mosquito eggs would hatch off by the gazillions. And you hear about how bad mosquitoes were in the 40s and 50s. But when we arrived here, they were every bit as bad then, in 58, as they were in 1950, when a light trap at the old ferry landing trapped 360,000 salt marsh mosquitoes in one night. And that was the world's record. Sanibel had the record. I should add that the light on the trap failed, so it was not a complete collection during the dark period. And since then, on Grand Cayman Island, the same type of trap has trapped more mosquitoes, but it's not that many more. So Sanibel still has, in my mind, the world's record. So the Sanibel Mosquito Control District started up, and it used DDT, and they had some fogging, a fogging truck, and they fogged, but it couldn't cope with the problem. So the state legislature in about early 58 established the Lee County Mosquito Control District, and they appointed Wayne Miller, an engineer from Georgia, as their executive director. And the state provided him with a number of drag lines, earth digging machines. And he made it his goal to control mosquitoes on Sanibel-Captiva, because testing of mosquitoes, radioactive marking of mosquitoes on Sanibel in a state study showed that those mosquitoes produced on Sanibel would migrate 25 or 30 miles inland. So the nuisance mosquitoes in Fort Myers were generated here on the barrier island. So Sanibel-Captiva was the main goal, to control mosquitoes. So they wanted to come up with a biological mosquito control program. So they began to channelize the main Sanibel slough down through the middle of the island. And as they got one main cut made, they would go off in tributary cuts, tributary ditches, to other depressions where mosquito eggs could hatch. So by doing that, they provided permanent water in that section of Sanibel, like between Beach Road and Donak Street, for example. That would all be done and all be sub-channeled. So when the rains came, the water rose, and mosquito-eating fish like gambusia would be carried out through the tributaries and devour these mosquito larvae. And then go on to the next section. So by the time they were done with all the way to Chateau-sur-Mer in like 64, there was a good program of biological mosquito control, and we started to see mosquito populations drop dramatically. And we're talking about the same time that the bridge came in. You know, 63, 64 is when things began to change population-wise. Before that, we were a quaint little island with 400 people that knew everyone. So things were about to change after 63. But they also did have a chemical control program, and they flew DC-3s, and they used chemicals. They used DDT in the first years, but Miller was very progressive, and he outlawed using that. Then they used a chemical called parastrine on the larvae of mosquitoes. They graduated to malathion, and by then the refuge had expanded to its full boundary, approved boundary, and we had more control on the application of pesticides on the island, so we began to regulate mosquito control. And that was one of the jobs that I did, to coordinate mosquito control efforts between the refuge and the county. And nowadays, I can't speak as to what changes have been made in the program in the past 25 years, but I assume you're still, those of you who live here, are still pretty mosquito-free, aren't you? That's all because of that initial program and Wayne Miller's attitude toward mosquito control. And this very building we're standing in, one day in sometime in the 60s, Roy Bezier was director of the SCCF, and he wanted to form a basis for the visitor center. So this was pre-George Campbell, before he started his little uprising. Fred Lesser was an employee of the Mosquito Control District, and Bill Hammond, who's a famous personality in conservation here in Lee County, and I got on a mosquito control bulldozer that was brought over here, and we came out off Sanibel-Captiva Road, and we laid out the entrance road and went a little further where this building would be placed.
Amazing. Yeah, Jim Piggins had told me that Island Inn was open the first time in the summer, the rainiest summer they had in the middle of the 1950s, because the more rain there was, the more mosquito-eating fish there were, and the lower the number of mosquitoes. So he said it was the rainiest year that they were actually able to stay open in the summertime. A lot of people think of that just being the opposite, that the wetter we are, the worse the mosquitoes are, but that's not necessarily the case.
I always like to say that Sanibel-Captiva, during that time period, had 3 strikes against them. They had the first strike against, this is to change it forever. The first strike was good mosquito control. The second strike was construction of the causeway. You may think that was the worst thing that affected us, the causeway and traffic, but it wasn't. It was when Island Water Association produced island-wide potable water. That's what dramatically changed this place forever. And without the activity of conservation groups and the Refuge to safeguard the land and some early good city programs, imagine where we would be today.
So I'm going to give Charles' voice a break for just a second, just to say that in his semi-autobiography, I guess, in Sanibel Light, which is now electronically published, he talks about moving into the lighthouse headquarters, he and Jean, and tasting their coffee the first morning and realizing that it was sulfur water, but having to take a jug over to Tommy Wood's house to get potable water and carry that back over. And I know when IWA set up in 1965, it really accelerated the development of the islands. I can't imagine those early years when things got sulfurous. How deep were those wells that went down?
The well at the lighthouse, we had cistern water that came out of one cistern at quarters 1 where Tommy Wood lived, and it was piped over to our kitchen. But the shallow well, we had a jet pump that just went down into the surface water aquifer, and it wasn't bad. But then in '65, the Coast Guard put in a artesian well just a little less than 600 feet. And they had the water that came in with that well been near potable, then the lighthouse would have been gobbled up and we'd have an immense Coast Guard station there today. But because it came in at too high a salinity, and there was no reverse osmosis in those days, the Coast Guard abandoned their plans to develop the lighthouse, and now it's a city park. But we drank on a regular basis rainwater, and I would go, before I ran a pipe. Now I think at this particular time the cistern had gone down, and the pipe from Tommy's house into his kitchen was where I could get a 5-gallon jug of water. So I went and got a 5-gallon jug, and I carried it. I was a lot younger then, and I carried it down the stairs and across the lighthouse grounds, up my stairs, and put it on a water cooler that we rented. And one day I went to get a glass of water or a pitcher to make tea, and something caught my eye, and I looked in the glass with a pitcher, and through the window looking out over the Gulf, and I saw all of these little filaments in the water. And I said, what in the blank is that? So I took the glass of water over to Tommy. I said, look at this, look what we're drinking. You know, what it was, I'm pretty sure it was, we had asbestos roofs on the lighthouse buildings, and these were filaments of asbestos. that we had been drinking for probably 5 years and never noticed.
And you're still here.
We're fireproof.
And in your 80th year. Not quite 80. But you're there. Yeah. That's pretty good. So I guess one of the things that a lot of people came for is the story I'll ask you next. I told Charles earlier it's easy for me to remember the time that he first decided he would start working on sea turtles, because he was at a gathering with friends on the beach, and some of the high school friends, I assume, were getting ready to butcher a turtle. And I told him, it's great. I remember the date. I don't even have to write it down because it was the month and the year I was born, which is June of 1954. So that was your first encounter with protecting a sea turtle. And I know there's a lot of twists and turns to it, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about those early years and what made you commit so much of your time to working with sea turtles.
It's going to be a long one.
I know. You might want to sit down for it.
No,
You're too excited about it. It's your life.
as Christy described, I had an encounter where I basically saved the life of a loggerhead turtle, and all the kids after that started calling me the turtle guy. And the rest of that 1954 summer up through the 1958 summer, whenever a turtle nested on Naples Beach, most people that lived on the beach knew that I was the one to call. So I would go out, and I started a monitoring program on loggerhead turtle nests. And I would study the incubation period and how long it took for the young to reach the water and things like that. Just general biology, because they're virtually in 1954, 55. You know, Archie Carr had written his book, Handbook of Turtles, but he really wasn't a sea turtle person at that time. He started out working on cooters and freshwater turtles and transformed into sea turtles a little bit later on. So I began to put all this stuff together. So when I came to Sanibel in '59, again, I had a beautiful place to work, and as part of my job, I would patrol the beaches at night to protect sea turtles from poachers and people that lived on Sanibel. Some of them are still alive on Sanibel. Took turtles off that beach every summer. Took them off, butchered them, and ate them. So it was common. It was just part of the things you do. And then I can remember a date too. On December 3rd, 1959. I can remember that date because there's an official record of it, and I have it in my book. I had just put up the flag at the flagpole at the lighthouse, and I was doing something to the flagpole, and this car pulled in. In those days, the road came up along the Gulf Beach and then into the lighthouse, and this car parked by the stairs, and an elderly gentleman got out of the car, and he basically straightened himself up, and he got a cane, and he started walking over toward me, and he said, "You must be the new man. I'm Ding Darling." And here I am, I'm what, 21, 22 years old, and this man's introducing himself to me. And I knew who Ding Darling was only through a cartoon that I had seen a few years before. It's one of the most dramatic conservation cartoons he did. It's called something about the toy deer in the Keys, the slaughtering of the key deer. It's one of his greatest cartoons in my mind. So I knew who Ding Darling was, but Tommy had never mentioned Ding Darling to me. And then he starts telling me, but I just saw a beautiful indigo snake by the community church. Too damn many cars. Those things just don't have a chance. And I said, well, Tommy's up in the office. I'm sure you can find him up there. And he went up the stairs, and I went about my business. And about a half hour later, Tommy called me. "Charles, come up and have a cup." So I went up and had a cup of coffee. It was early in the day. After 4:30, it may have been something else. It may have been a can. So I sat there in the kitchen in Tommy's quarters, and his wife Louise was away at the time, and they just started talking, and Ding Darling wanted to know. He had a very loud voice. He was hard of hearing. He sort of boomed, as Christy said. He had a deep voice. And he started querying Tommy about the ducks. How are the ducks faring this year? And they discussed ducks, and I'm just sitting there listening, drinking coffee. And then all of a sudden he wanted to know how the sea turtles did this past summer. And Tommy said, well, Charles was out on the beach quite a bit this summer working with turtles. And then he picked right up on that, and he said, if you're interested in turtles, you need to do something to help these turtles. Pardon the racial slur. He said, those poor things don't have a Chinaman's chance in hell of making it. So that introduced me to an endorsement of sea turtles. And from then on, I just started to develop a program. We began tagging turtles in '64 and increased trying to find ways and avenues to protect nests on the beach. And then in '68, things were starting to get a little heavy, so I decided that I should form an organization and try to get some private blood in here to help me, because I'm wearing thin, being out all night. And some nights I was virtually up all night long, caught a couple of hours and went to work. So we formed an organization with people here on the island. Sarita Van Vleck on Captiva was one of the original board members. She's not here today, I don't think. And we formed Coretta Research, and one of the things we aspired to do, and everyone was doing it in those days, was head starting little turtles. So we began to build a sea turtle farm on Tarpon Bay, hoping to raise turtles until they were a year old, loggerhead turtles, and then releasing them, giving them a little chance. And that was a state-endorsed program. We had state permits to do that. However, it was unsuccessful. We had too many problems with cold weather. We couldn't maintain temperature, so we decided to cut that down. So at about that time, SCCF offered to support us financially by being the recipient of donations. Donations would come in to SCCF and be dispersed to Coretta Research for us to fund our program. And that worked very well until about 1971. And we had an organization, we needed something to do, so then we began to increase our activities in on-beach turtle hatcheries as opposed to rearing live turtles, tagging, measuring, weighing. And by 1973, we decided, well, we're getting all this data on Sanibel-Captiva turtles, but we don't know much of what happens to them or what they do in the interim after they nest, so let's broaden the scope. So then we had other directors from other organizations, and by 1976, we broke from SCCF in '73, became a nonprofit on our own, and by '76 we operated 14 sea turtle units from Clearwater to Cape Sable, one up in North Florida. And we were gaining tremendous amounts of information on multiple nesting of turtles, relocation of nesting sites from Atlantic to the Gulf Coast to the Atlantic, just good basic data. But by '78, it was becoming a tremendous nightmare of administration. So we were like the turtle. We pulled ourselves into the shell and just concentrated on Sanibel-Captiva until through the summer of '91, I believe, and then SCCF was kind enough to take the load off my shoulders so I could go further into retirement, and they've been operating the program for the last 25 years with great results. And you know, it's like all the years that I spent, I think I spent 38 years in some mode of turtle research, conservation. All I ever dealt with are with loggerheads. But now they have nesting green turtles, Kemp's Ridleys, and even leatherbacks. And here I am out in the stadium watching it all happen. I think it's tremendous.
Thanks. I appreciate that. We really appreciate it entrusting the Sea Turtle program to SCCF. I think it's kind of nice for it to have kind of started being able to funnel funds through SCCF to fund the research that went statewide. But for you at the point of your retirement to give that project to us was a true honor. So thank you for that. So I wanted to ask you just a couple other things, and then I'm going to let the audience ask. But again, I'll let you get a drink of water. I lived in the house that Charles LeBuff lived in at Tarpon Bay before they've constructed the new residence there. And there were watermarks about that high up on the wall on the knotty pine. And I don't know if that was Hurricane Donna or what, but there was a high water mark in that house. I just remember how bad the no-see-ums were down there too. That place would flood all the time. And I remember Gene telling me once that the kids, in growing up down there, how tough it was with the no-see-ums and those screens, that Gene and Charles would put the kids in the back seat of the car and drive and drive and drive until the kids fell asleep so that they could put them to bed and not have to wake up at night with all the bugs all over them. So I remember that as one of the first stories you had told me about that place.
Well, that actually happened when we were still living at the lighthouse.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because we didn't have air conditioning at the lighthouse for the first 10 years. And the kids couldn't sleep. The sandflies would come in through the screens. And so we'd put them in the back seat of the car and just drive up and down Periwinkle with the windows down so they could get a good night's sleep.
Yeah. Right.
When we moved after 22 years at the lighthouse. We moved into a house at Tarpon Bay, the one you lived in, and we stayed there for a couple of years. And we had air conditioning then, so that was sort of cool.
I just never, really, it was. I just never knew where those high water marks came from unless it was Hurricane Donna or something that put that water stain up on there.
I think that Dewey Miller built that house, and he in '60 he was still operating the marina, the Tarpon Bay Marina, and that house wasn't built in '60. But we had some hurricanes, after that they weren't as severe as Donna or as Charlie, and put up high tide, so it could have been. But I didn't live there then.
Either that or dishwasher really or washing machine really overflowed. I don't know which it was.
I can tell you a funny little, just a real quick story, Chris,
Please.
on that house.
Please.
The house was built by Dewey Miller. He bought the land from the iconic Clarence Rutland, and he built a little fish camp marina on Tarpon Bay. And the government acquired it through a negotiated purchase, and there were 2 residences on it. And when the Fish and Wildlife Service decided they were leaving the lighthouse, they offered us quarters at Tarpon Bay, so that's the only reason we left the lighthouse. So the house, the living room of the house and the dining room were all paneled in beautiful knotty pine, varnished knotty pine. It was really a great job. And I've been detailed up to Tampa Bay. I was the field response coordinator for oil spills for the Fish and Wildlife Service between Crystal River and Everglades City. So I was detailed to Tampa Bay for a small oil spill, and I left Gene and other people to do the moving from the lighthouse to the quarters at Tarpon Bay. So I called in one night and talked to her, and she said something to the effect, "You wouldn't believe the way we've lightened this place up. We've painted the walls." She didn't paint the walls.
Because I remember that knotty pine. I remember that. All right. I promise that there will only be one more question before I turn it over to the audience, but I do have one more, and that is, Jing Darling passed away in February of 1962. And I know that he had been sort of a conservation leader here of the islands, and those last few years he wasn't here as much because his son had been in an accident. And he spent more time in Clearwater. But after he passed away, it seemed like there was a little bit of panic on the island that you've got, IWA doesn't come in until 65, but you have the causeway open, being constructed the year Darling passes away. You have mosquito control, and you have air conditioning becoming more readily available. So, and Lindgren has already started drag lining down at the east end even before the bridge was constructed. And so there seemed to be a lot of panic on the islands. So that little Ding Darling Memorial Committee that started up on the islands after Ding Darling passed away eventually worked to kind of get that land away from a state lease that was sort of nebulous back in the 1945 to become a national wildlife refuge instead of a lease of land from the state of Florida. So we have this little Ding Darling Memorial Committee, and it eventually evolves into SCCF. And I wonder if you could enlighten us just a little bit on that transition period, because you are the last remaining living original board member of SCCF. The asbestos hasn't hurt you that badly. Do you recall how that transitioned or how that happened?
I can remember a few elements. I recall when Ding Darling died, I was on my porch, and we didn't have private telephones on Sanibel in those days, but we did have a telephone in the office, and Tommy hollowed out the office window to me that Mr. Darling died. He had received a call from Mary Koss, Ding Darling's daughter, and he was taken aback. He was very close to Ding Darling because Ding Darling had provided housing for him at one time, and he was a fellow pilot, so they had some connections. And they both liked to bend their elbows when Ding was younger. And so things sort of just, I don't recall anything happening right away. But then Tommy received another call from Mary Koss advising him that there was a move to establish not only a foundation in Des Moines, but also a move to form a memorial committee on the islands. People like Harold Bixby and I've forgotten some of the other ones that were close friends of Ding Darling, wanted to do something to recognize the contributions he had made. So as time progressed, Tommy became a member of the Ding Darling Memorial Committee, representing not only the Fish and Wildlife Service, but also through his friendship with Ding Darling, he thought it was something that he was responsible to do through the friendship. And things progressed. I never attended any of those early committee meetings that I can recall. I think I may have later, after the acquisition program started, after the push to really develop Sanibel Refuge into a prominent refuge, began after 1962. The Fish and Wildlife Service decided that they would indeed develop a full-blown National Wildlife Refuge on the island. So they were committed. So they started out through a land acquisition program, acquiring lands within an approved boundary. The boundary of then Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge had to be authorized by the Lee County Commission, and we had a bad county commission back in those days. They let this bridge go through, but they did support and vote for the boundary, an approved boundary of the refuge. So we were off and running. So we started buying land, negotiated purchases, and we condemned land, we took it away, went to trial, fair market value was paid, nobody got screwed out of any money, although some of these Old timers may tell you they were, they really weren't. They got full market value. And about that time, the Ding Darling Memorial Committee began to adhere and push and form, they changed into the Sanibel-Captiva Conservation Foundation. And I started attending the pre-Conservation Foundation meetings representing Tommy's interest in the Refuge when he was flying off someplace. So when it came time to incorporate, I was selected as a founding board member. That's how I became involved. And then I served on the board until '71.
We appreciate that. Do we have any questions from the audience? Any burning questions that you might have? Rand?
I've once heard you speak about standing on your porch at the lighthouse and casting for snook and catching them. What does that mean about the way the island is changing in terms of that shore?
In 1947, there was a major hurricane that destroyed much of the land at the lighthouse. I don't like to call that place Lighthouse Point. There's a trend to do that, and that's not its right name. There's 100 lighthouse points in this country. Sanibel's, the name of that land is Point Bell. And if I say Lighthouse Point, I totally don't want to use the word, but I sometimes have to. So it destroyed, it eroded away a massive amount of the land on the Gulf side, and the sea kept encroaching through erosion. And by the time we arrived here in 1958, a spring tide, the house would be completely surrounded by water. We had a plank that we had to walk to the stairs to start up the stairs to avoid getting our feet wet or taking our shoes off. And that's the time that I could take a cast net and throw it off the porch and catch mullet, and with a mirror lure, caught snook in water, in the surf, what was basically surf fishing from the porch. Now it's all accreted in since then. But the point is disappearing. If you walk out on the very point, you'll see some old foundation pieces, and that's the old Coast Guard observation tower from World War II, but it's still, the footers are still visible.
There used to be a lot of things built between us and the house.
Originally, yeah, there were a lot of other structures, chicken coops and things that were out there in that Gulf. And in 1917, Joe Whiteman told me that, the late Joe Whiteman from Captiva, he climbed the lighthouse and threw a straw cap, and it landed way out in a field, and in that field they used to play baseball. And that's on the Gulf side of the lighthouse. So it's constantly changing. We rebuilt the fishing pier in '72, and that changed the current, the way the current sweeps around. So I think that's increasing the erosion on the very point of land. Bird.
Charles, you told me a story once about maybe a mile in from Tarpon Bay Road heading east. You saw a bunch of vultures flying over one morning, and you went back in and checked it and found something.
Good memory. I don't know what year it was,
I
but
think it must have been the early 60s.
it was after the bridge, and a group of, I was still in the Audubon, so it must have been like 64, 65. A group of Audubon people came down from Sarasota, and I was leading a canoe tour on the Sanibel River, and I borrowed the canoes. No, it was after the 60s, because Grady Edmondson was running Tarpon Bay Marina, and he had the canoes. So I borrowed like a dozen canoes for this group, and we put them in at Tarpon Bay Road and started east to explore the Sanibel River. And my son Chuck, he was only like 4 years old. I had him in the bow of the canoe, and we're paddling. I'm leading this group, and I'm just explaining vegetation and birds and whatever we saw. And all of a sudden, we heard this commotion, and hundreds of vultures just crashed up out of the underbrush off to the right and got airborne. And Chuck got all excited. "What is that, Daddy? What is that?" I said, "Well, let's go see." So I told the people to wait there. I was going up in one of these tributaries mosquito control had dug. We went up in there, not very far, 100, 150 feet. And these buttonwood strands were just beginning to invade the Sanibel River system. And here was beat down vegetation everywhere and alligator remains all through the underbrush. And there were 23 alligator carcasses. I collected 23 skulls where poachers had gone in and killed them and skinned them. And for years I never knew who did it. And I'd stake out places, and to Gene's chagrin a few times, and never apprehended any alligator poachers. So I knew a few of the people here. There was one family here, they're all gone now, that skinned alligators regularly. We couldn't catch them. Got close one night, couldn't catch them. And I knew it wasn't them because when they killed an alligator, if they went out and killed an alligator in the slough, they would skin it, and some of them would skin it and shove the remains down in the cave. Alligators dig dens, so they would shove the remains down in an alligator cave so the vultures couldn't get it. You would never find the remains of the skinned out alligator. But I want to come back to something here, remind me that I do, if I forget it. It's a nice little story. And so finally I talked to one of these renegade alligator poachers one time. And, no, it wasn't me. This is long after we were all much more mature. But I found out years later through an alligator hunter in Naples that it was a group of Naples people that came up here trying to clean out our alligators. Now, the story that I want to go back. I mentioned these people that skinned alligators habitually. Well, they owned land, they had a home on land that was being brought into the Refuge through the acquisition program. And they lived up on Sanibel-Captiva Road, right across the street from where the show museum is now. And after we closed on the area, one of my duties was to go and inspect the boundaries, be sure I could find the survey boundaries, note any alterations to the land, any structures, what have you. So there was an enormous grove of Australian pines before we killed them on the east side of the property, and I'm walking in through there, and I came on this, when I got into this grove of pine trees, this is no joke, there were 3 trees, big pine trees. One of them had the remains of alligators, this high, melting, rotting down into the ground. Another tree had loggerhead turtle shells and skulls and remains melting into the ground. And the third tree had gopher tortoise shells melting into the ground. And no camera. For some reason I never went back and photographed that. I recorded it in the Refuge files, but it was never photographed. And one day I thought I'd go back there and look for it. In fact, I got a special use permit to collect some small mangroves I wanted for some Calusa weapons I was replicating. And I started to go back in there to look for them, but they had burned the trees down in the controlled burn program. After I actually had killed them years before. Those were the kinds of people that lived here on the island in the old days. This was not a real friendly place to live, but what place was in the early days, right? We always, wherever we are, we have our share of outlaws.
Yeah. All right. We do have, I don't want to take away from the end of Charles, and there may be 1 or 2 other questions, but we do have a birthday celebration for the Earth to do as well with refreshments, and I want you to stay for that. Charles, your life is fascinating, and I'm so pleased that you've been able to write some of it down. And I know Jim, I know you're hiding some stories back there, and Ralph, you probably are too. He's back there grinning, you two. So, so they can tell on Charles at a later date, but I know some of your books are out at the table there, and you and Chris had worked on the herpetology book for the islands. And again, it's just been a real privilege to be able to spend a little time with you this afternoon. And I wish it could go on forever, but I'm also noticing there's a couple people getting a little restless. We want you to stay around and sing happy birthday. But any last thing you want to share with us before?
No, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Like I told you in the beginning, I always like to talk about the old days. And come by Macintosh Bookshop any Sunday and we'll continue the conversation.
And I would just like to reiterate how grateful a community that really doesn't know how much you volunteered your time. I just, for myself personally, to say thank you for all you've given this island. It's a real legacy. All right, I think we'll sing happy birthday out here. We're gonna get ready and, oh, Red, look at this. Look, whoops, something's happening.
On behalf of the board, what you've heard today is a love story, and it wasn't just about the one that started in high school between you two. And it wasn't just about the people you named that are here, our environmental leaders and teachers, and those that you named that aren't here. It's about what all of us are involved in. So the president of our board has declared that we should sing happy birthday to our Mother Earth. And in fact, what you've taught us is, I think, what Holmes Royston said, who most people feel is the father of ecological science and the ethics of environmental care. And he said, until we personalize our environment and the creatures we share it with, we cannot save them. So, let us sing to our Mother Earth, the dear planet. Ready? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear planet. Happy birthday to you. And thank you for your love story.
Thank you.
All right, there's waters and sodas over there, and we're gonna get ready and cut a little birthday cake. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thank you.
That was terrific. He's selling these videos or something?
We're gonna think we're gonna put it on our
I'm going to the table.
All right.
Good, I know. This was fun.
He could just go on and on and on.
Good job.
I don't know. It was fun.
It was a lot of fun.
No. I don't see him much anymore.
I see him once in a while with him now and then.
I see him on Sunday sometimes doing yard work when I go to work. Yeah, we went to high school. We were in the same class in high school. That's what we had. This island had only been 5 miles further offshore. Yeah, right.